Hidden in the Heartland.
Hello, this is Kels Goodman, and this is our new Hidden in the Heartland podcast. Over the coming weeks and months, my friend Mark Burris and I will be starting up some discussions about the Heartland research. And we're also open to guests in the future. Our ultimate goal is to start up another season of Hidden in the Heartland. You know, you can watch all of the previous Heartland material on this YouTube channel for free. If you like what you see, please subscribe. We also invite you to help us financially by donating to our Give, Send, Go campaign, which is specifically for producing Season 3. And you can do that on the link below. Thank you, and we hope you enjoy this podcast. Well, good morning, and welcome to another episode of Hidden in the Heartland podcasts. And we're on a chipper morning. This is Kels Goodman, producer of Hidden in the Heartland TV show. And with me is, of course, Mark Burris from the other side of the galaxy. Well, today, what I wanted to do is we're going to dive into the Hill Cumorah. That's going to be our discussion today. And first, before we start, I wanted to try to do every episode to give you kind of a resource minute. And because that way you can, when you're doing your own research, you want to be able to find from the, horse's mouth, so to speak, where the information comes from to help us find evidences of who was here in America long before Columbus. And that's really the way you need to look at it. Not necessarily that we know exactly where things are in Book of Mormon archaeology, but that we can at least have fun just trying to find, pieces of evidence that could connect. And here's one. This is actually, I found this book from my friend, Steve Smoot. Now, Steve Smoot made a really awesome documentary about ancient America and sort of the cover-up. He kind of went into Manifest Destiny and all that. But the book I'm actually holding is from one of the gentlemen that he interviewed in his documentary. And this is Roger Kennedy. And Roger Kennedy actually was a former bigwig at the Smithsonian. He has since passed away. But before in the 90s, beforehand, he wrote this book, and it's a fascinating, but you can see I've got it if you see me visually, you can see I've got a lot of marks in there because I'm constantly pulling something new from this book. But Hidden Cities by Roger Kennedy. It's all about the discovery of lost, civilizations in North America. And he was one of those that sort of I don't want to use the word converted because that's not, we're not here to convert anyone, but he did kind of go from the mentality of, who was here before Columbus were, ignorant savages to, there was a little more intelligence to the people that lived here beforehand. And he kind of woke up to the idea that there's way more. In fact, I remember the first chapter, he talks about how he went into a cave on one of his expeditions, and in the cave, I think it was somewhere in Illinois, and he talks about how in that cave that he realized, he thought he was the first one, to ever go into this cave until he found footprints and pieces of sandals and things like that. And he realized that he was not the first one, that he was beat by somebody by 1,500 years. And his writing is really eloquent. He's really very intelligent guy, very, a lot of his true authority as to the things that he studies. And so if you want to hear stuff from an authority, Hidden Cities by Roger Kennedy, and I'm sure you can find it online somewhere. So there's your little resource minute. I wanted to also kind of go in. This is a quick little piece of advertisement. It's not really, but my dad, I'm going to shift gears for just a moment and just take 1 minute, because I'm going to start putting some of these possibly online. My dad was actually the first missionary in an island called Niue, which is, or Niue. I'm sure I'm not giving it the proper pronouncement, but it's in the Polynesian Islands. And before he passed away, he wrote a book about his trip to Niue and how dangerous it was. So imagine the other side of heaven, but with a little more of an Indiana Jones flair to it. And that's what he did. So we are in the middle of recording the audio version of this book. So he just had a book written, and he printed about 1,800 copies, and then he passed away. And guess where those copies went? In my storage unit. So anyway, so I have a bunch of these, but they've been kind of hard to move because I'm not a bookstore by any means. But we did make an audio version. We're in the middle of making an audio version of it. And Scott Christopher, who does the voiceover for Hidden in the Heartland and is also the lead star in America Revealed, he is now doing the voiceover for this Niue book. So it's kind of a neat thing. It'll be coming up, and I'll probably be posting them on this YouTube channel for those of you who are on YouTube. So anyway, it'd be kind of fun. Okay, so let's dive into Hill Cumorah. The Hill Cumorah. Oh my goodness. That's just like the piece of controversy. And I think it's awesome that I brought Mark here, because Mark lives right by it. And so he's had a lot of experience with it. So Mark, kind of just in a quick overview, when you were managing the store there in Palmyra, and you were there seeing the visitors that would come every once in a while to the store, talk about the confusion that I think visitors would have when it came to the Hill Cumorah and where we all thought the Book of Mormon really happens.
Yeah, I guess, you get a lot of visitors. There'd be kind of two groups of people.
Yeah.
You'd have one group of people that'll be like, yeah, that's where the plates came from. And that was it. And then you'd have another group of people that would be like, oh yeah, that's the Hill Cumorah. That's where, the last battles happened, at least in the area. A lot of people think that everything happened at that hill, which the scriptures are pretty clear with, that there were lots of things going on, that was one place where battles were happening. Yeah. But, what's interesting to me is kind of, you go to the Hill Cumorah, and if anybody's been to the visitor center, there's not much really about the hill. It's kind of a general visitor center. It talks about the Book of Mormon. It talks about the area. To me, it's a little bit disappointing that they don't have anything about like how the hill was purchased or acquired, or the modern history of the hill. There's none of that.
Yeah.
So there's just a lot of confusion. People don't quite know what to make of it. And, other than the pageant, a lot of times the hill would be something that would be skipped. People would go to the Sacred Grove, would go to the Grandin building where the Book of Mormon was published, but they were just sort of like, well, that's where the plates came from, but we're not going to spend too much time there. And it's really unfortunate, because it's an awesome place.
Yeah, I think that I'm with you on that. And I remember my last trip to the Hill Cumorah, which was 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 4.5. I remember I combed the visitor center looking for any discussion in the little visitor center where they have all the images and the videos. There was not one discussion about the Book of Mormon and the hill talking, like, what is that hill? Like the only thing is the plates were deposited there, and that's it. There's no emphasis on battles, no emphasis on any historical reference. It was just simply just like a missionary tool, which is great. I mean, that's the good stuff. But obviously, they've kind of forgotten why we're here, why we're at this hill. Why couldn't you just take that same, set and stick it somewhere else? It doesn't matter, but it's here at this specific hill for a reason. And yeah, and I'm with you. I think I wonder if it's just the confusion that has now been created because of them, saying that it's not the final hill. So,
and I don't even remember, and I'm probably completely wrong, but there wasn't even the Doctrine and Covenants section that talks about glad tidings from Cumorah.
yeah.
So there's even kind of that disconnect there, and I think you could literally pluck that visitor center up and put it anywhere in the world, and no one would even know that it was the Hillcumorah Visitor Center.
That's a good point. You could stick it in Salt Lake City, and it would just look like any other. Yeah, that's
you could put it near any temple in the world, and people would say, "Oh, that's great." Other than it does reference like the Whitmer Farm and the Grandin Building and things like that. You wouldn't even know. So yeah.
And I think what's interesting is we all know, for those of you who are probably new to this, one of the reasons why we are feeling like this is an issue is because, and this is a review for those of you who are already fans of Hidden in the Heartland, because we do cover it in one of our episodes. It's either episode 7, 8, or 9, or 10. I can't remember, but
watch them all.
Watch them all. Just watch them all. Yeah. Whatever one is called the Two Hill Cumorah theory, and that is basically the theory is that there is a second hill. That this hill is not the hill with the battles and the hundreds of thousands of deaths and the end of the Nephites and the Jaredites, but that this is the hill that Moroni simply deposited the plates and Joseph picked them up. And so the big question is, well, there's a discrepancy there, and that's the kind of discrepancy that Mark is kind of mentioning. And I think it's fascinating. I remember when I first heard that there's a second hill, I kind of thought, that's kind of who created that? And we know that the creation of that goes back to about the 1930s, when it, I think one of the reasonings for it is this, is we all know if you study the scriptures, I know, well, let me back up for a moment. Forgive me. When I was on my mission, I remember showing Ancient America Speaks video on my mission and saying it all happened in Central America, and I didn't even give it a second thought. But then there's that concern that, well, Hillcumorah is way up here, Central America is way down there. That's a 3,000-mile walk, okay? And so the thought is, if you don't read your Book of Mormon clearly, there's this notion that there's all these battles that happened down there, and then when everybody died, Moroni just huffed the plates on his back and the sword of Laban and everything else, and walked 3,000 miles and deposited everything up there at Hillcumorah, not putting two and two together that the Hillcumorah needs to be close to all the other cities that continually are mentioned. It's not this stretch that's so far away, but that they have to be together. People went from Zarahemla to Cumorah and back, and that was not in a matter of years. That was, it was whatever the traveling was not to that length. There was no way technically that could have been a real thing. Could be wrong, we totally could be wrong, but at this point in time, as the reality of people traveling, that's just kind of unfathomable to be able to think that Hillcumorah has to be separate. So in order to create the narrative that the Hillcumorah has to be close to all of the cities, the best thing to do is to create a new narrative that there's a second hill, and that Moroni. So currently, to this day, the BYU central Book of Mormon central mentality is that there are two hills, that there's a hill that you read in the Book of Mormon, and there's a second hill that Joseph Smith received the plates because Moroni unburied them and carried them up all the way to New York, and then reburied them for Joseph Smith to receive 1,600 years later. And the problem is, I have searched high and low for any kind of official statement on that notion that Moroni unburied the plates, moved them to New York, and reburied them for Joseph Smith to receive. There is nothing anywhere in any kind of doctrine whatsoever, Doctrine and Covenants, church history, nothing that says anything about a second hill. That is, and I'm that's one of the things I have to put my foot down on. And I'm a pretty open-minded person, and this is one that I have yet to see it, it is all fabricated by the guys at BYU and those related to all of the search in Central and South America, that it is a fabricated statement to think that that's where that happened, that Moroni unburied them and moved them up there. There is no evidence whatsoever of that second hill, period. Now, until that evidence shows up, unless there's some kind of church authority saying something, it is false. That's kind of where, and I'm, like I said, I'm open-minded to being wrong about things, but this is one where I can't find anything. And it is it is actually a big misnomer in any kind of Book of Mormon archaeology, is to think that happened. And so because that is false, when you do any kind of research on where things could have happened, you got to start really honestly at the Hill Cumorah and work your way backwards. And that's where it just baffles me that's the kind of, and I don't mean to be passionate about that kind of thing, but it's so wild that's where that's the notion now, but it's a totally false notion.
Also, when you read the Book of Mormon and you read about the Book of Mormon coming forth to the Lamanites, it's very much indicating, as soon as this is pulled up out of the ground, they'll be taught like that was the covenant, and it would be in the same place.
Yeah.
So it isn't something where, oh, well, this record's going to come to you, but it's going to bounce back and forth. It was literally published in the same land, and then missionaries were sent to these people, fulfilling that promise that's in the text. It's over and over and over again that the Lamanites would receive the record. The Lamanites would receive the record. Like, it was something that was very, very important. Like, very early on in the book that those covenants are made.
Yeah.
So it's kind of sad because it's like it's very much seeped into the culture of the church. Like the Hill Cumorah pageant, they would say Hill Cumorah and Cumorah's Hill, so they would try to distinguish that there were two. The artwork of the church, very much, and most of these artists were given that what do they call it, artistic license to do the art. But everything that we're familiar with, we see, oh, well, look, the Savior's appearing on a pyramid, or the Waters of Mormon, or that has to be Central America. So like, it kind of changed everybody's mentality and thought process, other than that famous picture of Moroni bearing the plates. Like, you can see that it is North America.
Yeah.
But everything else is very much, Central South America, a lot more exciting. Arnold Freeberg, he wanted it to be very exciting. But it's really unfortunate because, like, instead of focusing really on the text and what it's saying, and what the prophet Joseph said, and what these early members said, and that they're all agreeing that it's the Hill Cumorah. Everybody that's close to Joseph, they're all agreeing to that. We're just sort of like, well, this place is kind of cool and that's kind of fun. And so we're gonna put a second hill down there because 100,000 men could have died on this hill, even though we know that that's how many died in Cumorah land,
Yeah.
not necessarily the hill, but the area around about. And we'll probably go into that a little bit more of the evidence of the Cumorah land. There's
Yeah.
evidence of genocides and huge wars. And on the Hill Cumorah, there's evidence that as many men died as Moroni said died.
Yeah. No, that's very true. In fact, that's a good segue because I think if you want to understand New York archaeology, because I'll be honest, it was just a few years ago where I thought New York and archaeology are not like that. To me, when I think of New York, I think of big buildings and a million people, and I can get me out of here. That's what I think of when I think of New York, and I don't realize that there's so much more to New York. Once I started visiting these sites, that realizing that there was a mass amount of people that were here anciently. DeWitt Clinton, who was a former governor of New York, and probably in the early 1800s, made numerous statements about the ancient people in New York, and he spoke highly of who they were, and really had a real curiousness about their artifacts.
And he prophetically said, if we ever find a record of these people, it'll either be written in metal or in stone.
Oh, that's right. I remember that quote. That's a great quote.
That's interesting to me, because it's like, well, how does he know that? Well, they're pulling up stone and they're pulling up metal.
So he had a real hand in church history, I think, that we aren't aware of, even though he was never baptized or anything. But he knew that there was definitely something there. And as far as the hill being a battle place, totally. I mean, I remember, I don't know who gave the story. Somebody gave the story about how there actually at one point was a lot of artifacts there. Might have been the Hendersons. Those who know the Hendersons, who are related to Willard Bean. She's actually made a documentary, and in the documentary about Willard Bean, they talked about the arrow points that they had actually stored at the Hill Cumorah place that were found all around the Hill Cumorah. And there was a lot of those. Do you remember that story?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here in Palmyra, very common for farmers during plowing season to plow up, well, they'd say bushels and barrels of arrowheads. So, they were hauling them off back when farming was very close to the ground. You saw these arrowheads come up.
Yeah.
But of course, over time, you're going to run out of, run out of the material that you're bringing up. I know in the area when farmers, a lot of the walls that have separated fields, for instance, they've been there for quite a while, since the 1800s, and there's been farmers that have moved these walls because they want to change a field, and they're finding artifact, and they're finding evidence of bones, where these walls used to be. So there's still things that are there. But when you're talking about a couple hundred years of farmers doing what they do, also the hill, typically, if a tree falls down, or you've got a really harsh winter and a fast spring, you still see arrowheads up there. A tree falls down in the root ball, you'll see a couple different arrowheads. And what's interesting is they're from two different cultures. There's Adena points and there's Hopo points. So, it's kind of an interesting thing that they're being found there.
Yeah.
And you have someone that goes, well, I've walked up and down the hill. The church planted grass all over it, and I haven't found anything. And you go back and the late 80s, early 90s, and there was a lot of terraforming that was done to the hill when they changed the Hill Cumorah pageant. There's a lot of things that have happened, a lot of building that's happened, and it would be nice to be able to walk up there and walk out with pockets full of arrowheads. But that's not something that's going to happen right now because it happened.
Yeah, and you also, and then when you think of the battle, I mean, again, a lot of these things you have to discover through reasoning, because we don't really know the evolution of everything. We just plain don't know. But from history of other things, of other places, like, for example, I use the example in Hidden in the Heartland of the Civil War. Okay, the Civil War is now up on 200 years old. Right. It's getting, we'll be reaching 200 years since the Civil War. But in the 200 years, how much Civil War stuff are you finding? You're finding almost nothing. And even some that had the battle, I think I forgot the name of the place, but there's one specific place where there was a battle that happened where I think of almost 20,000 people died in a single day. And in that location, today, you can't find hardly anything. You can hardly find a bullet. You're not going to find any bodies. You're not going to find anything. And that's only not even 200 years ago. So now add another 1,400 years to that, and you think you're going to find something? I mean, that's just kind of, that's hard pressed thinking, especially with farmers and the evolution of people coming and who knows, the Lamanites at the end of the battles, and you got it down to just a handful of people there, and the Lamanites being bloodthirsty, are they going to do any kind of reverencing back then of preservation? They probably just walked away. I mean, who knows? It's all just reasoning, but you can't expect there to find anything like we would today. And so you can't put today's mind in the past and think that that's how they do things. You just can't. You have to be open-minded and ready. And the only evidence we've got of a Hill Cumorah is that there's a hill, and Joseph Smith said so. That's it. That's what we've got right now. And that's kind of what we're going off of. And that does make it difficult. I admit to that it does make it difficult. But
and those that are looking for physical items, any historic society in Western New York has a large collection.
That's true. That's true. Doesn't the local university have a lot of elements there?
University of Buffalo has millions and millions of artifacts, and much of them are from this area. And I think I went on their website, and I think they have like 200 on display.
Wow.
But they tote on the University of Buffalo, I think their anthropology department. You can actually look on the website, and it says, hey, we have millions and millions of artifacts. So a lot of these organizations have artifacts. They just don't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
There's not a whole lot of money in North America artifact.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it ends up in boxes. A lot of it ends up, Smithsonian. I've seen some of your episodes of Hidden in the Heartland, and then also like Scott Walter, America on Earth, where he goes to the Smithsonian and they're showing these rooms. They're just full of stuff, mastodon bones and things like that they don't put on display, but they're definitely things that denote a more advanced civilization with more to it than what we ever knew. And it's sitting in the basement of the Smithsonian.
Yeah.
I didn't know a whole lot about woolly mammoths in North America, and the Smithsonian has the bones in the basement, So.
Oh yeah. And I think in fact, ironically, I've got an article here. Excuse me. I have an article here that I'm not going to go into because that's not our discussion, but I just want everybody to kind of, you could probably find this online. It's called "Why Do Tourists Visit Ancient Ruins Everywhere Except the United States?" And it pretty much goes into the romanticism of going somewhere else and seeing something elsewhere, and then you come to America and it's like, oh, it can't be here, or it's not that important. It's not as important as going down to Central America or going over to Europe and seeing, Stonehenge or Jerusalem or anything like that. We think that our stuff is not as important, and for some reason it's more important and more romantic somewhere else. So it's really fascinating read. So if you can find it, you obviously, for those of you who are listening, that's the name of the article. It says here, Priceonomics. I don't know much about Priceonomics. I don't know if that's a magazine or what it is, but that's the article. If you type in, why do tourists visit ancient ruins everywhere except the United States, you can find it. So anyway, so it's an interesting read. I wanted to kind of shift the gears just slightly because we're this. I almost felt like this could be a two-parter, and so we're going to have a second segment that we're going to bring in for the following week, continuing about the Hill Cumorah, but also going into something else that's really kind of fun and cool. But the other thing I wanted to dive into, and this is an interesting background, I got this from so Rand Packer. He's a I don't know if he's grandson or son of
He's grandson. His mother is Palmyra.
Okay,
Palmyra
that's right.
Bean. So he's a grandson, yeah.
Yeah, okay. No, that's of Willard Bean. So he's a direct relative of Willard Bean, and Willard Bean is a very in the Hill Cumorah discussion. Willard Bean is a very important element in that discussion, and I remember, just sort of as a little background, I'm going to tout this just a little bit as a filmmaker, so I apologize, but there's the movie The Fighting Preacher, which is out. Well, and it was produced by T.C. Christensen, who's a good friend of mine. Well, before he did that, I actually wrote an early draft of The Fighting Preacher because I wanted to direct the movie. But TC has a little more power than I got, and he's very well known and well established in the LDS film world. And so I didn't fight him on it. I said, it's all yours, brother. Go have a good time, because we're good friends. And he's a really good filmmaker. Even though there were things that I would have done differently, there's even a few scenes that I actually wrote word for word, and because he read my script and paid me, so it wasn't anything negative, but some scenes I actually wrote for The Fighting Preacher.
What scenes did you write?
I wrote the scene where he uses the phone for the first time. And that was my creation, because I always thought that would be funny to see him using the phone for the first time. And that was one that I created. And there's a few others I can't remember off the top of my head, but that's the one that I specifically remember. And there were some things that he presented that I didn't, like I said, they're an artist's, somebody taking artist license, creative license to be able to do, the ending of Palmyra saying, come on, Dad, let's just love everybody. That's not totally accurate, but that's not the subject of this episode, but it's still, him being a fighter actually brought people together. In the film, they kind of gave the impression that him being a fighter was what was pushing people away in Palmyra. But it actually was a tool that, even though he was beating people up, it was getting people to actually respect him. And so, but it still is a fine film, and TC's awesome. And that's not what I wanted to go into today. So, but Rand Packer came to me, and when I was considering getting the rights to the book, we had a discussion about his son, Cameron Packer. And Cameron wrote a journal here for BYU, and it's basically about the Cumorah Cave. Now, let me back this up for people who aren't aware of this, but a lot of people have never heard of the idea that there's a possibly a second chamber. And again, this is all possibly that there's a second hole in the Hill Cumorah that was artificially made. And I think, just to set the stage, Mark, you mentioned about the artificial hill. Tell us about that quote about the artificial hill.
Oh, so well, I guess a little bit of a backup, but Cameron, he in his article he says cave, but what's interesting is that the brother never really mentioned cave. They always call it room.
Yeah, that's just the
So
title
it's
of
always
his article. Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, it's interesting that he chose the word cave, but they always say room, and they're always very like they tell you exactly the size of it, and it's very descriptive. Oliver Cowdery was in Kirtland, and W. Phelps was in Missouri, and they wrote letters back and forth through the Evening and Morning Star. And I was kind of going through these letters that were back and forth. There's a lot of really great Hill Cumorah stuff. There's letter number 7 that talks about the Hill Cumorah, and it's very, very descriptive. Very, very good article. You know, there's a lot of people that are kind of fighting over it, that Oliver Cowdery is just saying what he wants to say, whatever the case may be. But W. Phelps, he actually he describes the Hill Cumorah as an artificial hill, and he says that artificial hill of Western New York, where millions of Nephites and Jaredites perished, will stand as a monument to millions in the last days. And it's interesting to me that he calls it an artificial hill. So why is he mentioning that? And then you go down the line, and you have brethren like Brigham Young that's giving a conference talk, and he's talking about, well, when Joseph brought the plates back with Oliver, and the experience that happened, that they walked into a room that was in the side of the Hill Cumorah, that this room was 16 by 16, that it was filled with records, that there was just walls filled with records, that there was a table, that the sword of Laban was laid out on the table, that the angel, the messenger, we don't know if it was Moroni or who it was, but mentioned that sword would remain there until, you know, the New Jerusalem had been built, and that the records would move to the New Jerusalem. So it's very interesting how descriptive it is. We don't know when that message was passed to Brigham Young, but it's mentioned 2 or 3 times during a general conference where he's talking about this room in the Hill Cumorah, and he's just to me, it's so interesting how descriptive it is. Like it almost, I can see Joseph, and I don't know how it happened, and I don't know exactly where the story came from, but I could see him sitting with these brethren and saying, like, look, this is what happened. and the more descriptive something is to me, the more I have a tendency to go, oh yeah, wow, you know, if you're that descriptive,
you have a little more information on it.
Seems like maybe you were in a room, you were in an actual room. And we know that, you know, in the scriptures, it talks about that records were kept at a hill Shem, and then later they were moved because they were worried that the Lamanites might get a hold of them. And, you know, I don't know if there was preparation that happened to prepare a space in the Hill Cumorah and to cover it up, to make it, you know, inconspicuous, so that no one knew that that's where the records were.
Yeah.
I don't know. So.
Well, I think that, actually, I've got a few of these. I was just going to read 1 or 2 of them verbatim. I think that, or just right in front of me, actually. And they, it's, obviously when you, again, when you throw reason into it, if you look into the Book of Mormon, and you see that there was more than just this set of plates where they just, you know, whoever the prophet was at the time, just or the keeper of the plates, the history keeper, just started batting on it, and then handed it to, you know, the son, and handed it to the son, and handed it to the son each time, trying to keep it preserved. That there wasn't more than just a book, that there was oodles. And in fact, that's what it says here. I was just going to read there. This article is actually written in 2004. It was a Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, And it does say the views expressed in this article are the views of the author and do not necessarily represent the Maxwell Institute. And so if you believe in two hills, you couldn't believe in this. So because my personal take is, if you're Moroni and you're the last guy on Earth, right? Or not on Earth, I'm being facetious, but if you're the last guy there,
It felt like it. So
yeah, I'm sure it felt like it, but it's that's a lot of weight for what is described in this cave or in this room. That is a lot of weight to have to carry all the way from Central America to, New York for 3,000 miles. That's probably one of the reasonings that I'm bringing in here. Again, I don't know, but it just feels like that would be a lot of weight to carry. And that in my personal opinion, I feel like the Hill Cumorah was a place that anybody who had access, who was the keeper of the scriptures, who was the keeper of the history, had to have a place where they always went, and it was preserved because, first off, it was gold, and two, they loved destroying history. The bad guys always loved destroying history. That was always, they still do it to this day. They love to change and destroy history, but they, there had to be a safe place to put all of this history and to stick it so that they didn't. And that's why they probably moved numerous times. We hear about the hill Shim being one of the other hills that they hid the history before they had to move it to another one. And there was probably other places before even the hill Shim where they had to hide it and preserve it and just make sure that we just don't know about.
Yeah, we know there was a lot of travel, and it's not like they landed at the foot of the Hill Cumorah and were like, hey, this is where we're going to put the brass plates, we're just going to stick it in that hill. But that ended up being the last place. And and a lot of people will say, well, why was Joseph just given the abridgment? Well, we know that he had a hard enough time with just that piece of record. He's like, hey, I can solve my family's problems by this record, either by selling the record, or he, there's indication that he thought that he would be able to sell enough copies of the Book of Mormon that he could get his family out of poverty. Yeah. So can you imagine if Moroni was like, hey, look at all these records in this whole room, look at all that. And then after that translation was completely done, then he's shown the records of the whole civilization, and he understands, hey, we're not going to do anything with that. But I think that helped Joseph understand really what the records were, by seeing everything that had been abridged, all of the records of these two civilizations. I think that was something that was helpful. And Moroni leaving the area, I'm sure he left the area for a time, while the Lamanites were chasing after him. And then he came back, to finally bury the abridgment in the top of the hill, to finish up the abridgment and to bury it at the top.
Yeah, I think I remember now Cleon Skousen. I have these cool recordings of Cleon Skousen from 1973 and 1974, like 60 of them, of him teaching teaching Book of Mormon at BYU. And one of the things he actually even mentioned the same thing about there being a room inside. And so it's not a creepy kind of, secondhand thing, even though most of these reports, he does state in this report that they are all secondhand. And so it's not, there's no real firsthand discussion about it, but there is plenty of secondhand that makes it. There's 10 of them right here. And I was just going to read one of them. One of them was manuscript history of Brigham Young, the 5th of May, 1867. It says, President Heber C. Kimball talked familiarity Say that 10 times real fast. To the brethren about Father Smith, Oliver Cowdery, and others walking into the Hill Cumorah and seeing records upon records piled upon tables. They walked from cell to cell, which is interesting, and saw that the records were piled up. And so these are just some highlights from it. Let's see if I can find another one. He opened, okay, so here's Brigham Young Journal of Discourses, 17th of June, 1877. It says Oliver Cowdery went with the prophet Joseph when he deposited the plates. Joseph did not translate all the plates. There was a portion of them sealed, which you can learn from the Book of Doctrine and Covenants. When Joseph got the plates, the angel instructed him to carry them back to the Hill Cumorah, which he did. Oliver says that when Joseph and Oliver went there, the hill opened, and they walked into a cave in which there was a large and spacious room. He says he did not think at the time whether they had the light or the sun or an artificial light, but that it was just as light as day. They laid the plates on a table. It was a large table that stood in the room. Under the table was a pile of plates as much as 2 feet high, and there were altogether in this room more plates than probably many wagon loads. They were piled up in the corners and along the walls. The first time they went there, the sword of Laban hung on the wall, and the second time it had been taken down and laid upon the table, like you were mentioning, Mark. Across the gold plates, it was unsheathed, and on it was written these words, quote, "The sword will never be sheathed again until the kingdoms of the world become the kingdom of our God and his Christ," which is really fascinating. And so these are some little pieces that obviously they're secondhand stories, but there's enough that it obviously makes it in some level of church history that is worth discussing. But when I throw the reasoning back into the two Hill Cumorah discussion, my question is this: if there is this chamber, to me, that continues the defense of this is the Hill Cumorah, because that's a lot of plates to move from Central America to North America in that time frame. It just seems unrealistic for Moroni to be doing that. Maybe he took a bunch of people and said, "Hey, we're going to go spend a couple of years and we're going to go all the way down and all the way back." I just don't think that's realistic. I just don't think that's again my take right now. Where I stand is that's another piece of evidence that shows that this hill is the hill that was mentioned of in the Book of Mormon, not
Yeah,
this
and
not
it
the
seems
second
like
hill.
I've had a lot of people say, well, the Lord just made sure that the plates were in the right place at the right time for the prophet Joseph, or whatever the case may be. Well, this is thousands of years in the making, and the Lord made sure that the plates and the other records were where they needed to be.
That's right.
I can't even imagine with the amount of exploration that's been done in Central and South America, and it's still going on. I can't imagine that there would be a cave where someone hasn't, gotten into it and exposed whatever artifacts there are to be had and sold them.
Yeah.
I can't imagine that. North America, it seems like we ignore a lot of things and we're just not digging it up because we're living our lives, and there's just not enough. There's not enough money in it. I know that of the properties the church has bought out east, the Hill Cumorah was their number one priority. They sent Willard Bean on a special mission to buy the hill, and it was, you don't leave until that hill's bought. It was a very important piece of property to them, even more important than the Adamon Diamond and other properties that you'd think, well, that's pretty important too. But yeah, I mean, it's just something that's been bought and it's been preserved, and it's, there's a beautiful visitor center there, and there's apartments for missionaries, and it's very well kept. It's very well preserved.
It is. It's a nice place. I really enjoy visiting, and I'm, eager to go back to visit again. And I encourage those of you who are listening to go visit the Hill Cumorah. It's a beautiful place amidst any of the controversy as to the things that people say. Continue to go and support it. And I think one last thing I wanted to bring up was the picture that we have, and I'm going to go ahead and stick it on the screen, and because I have a copy of this photograph now. Here's the story. This is a gentleman friend of ours. Mark and I both know him, and I'm going to keep his name off on this story because he's really hesitant, and that seems to be what happens when people find things. They always seem to be kind of hesitant because they don't want to be the center of the controversy. But I think it was about 20 some years ago, he was there helping out with the Hillcumorah pageant, and one of the group that he was with, I think it was one of his children, went to, and correct me, Mark, if I get this wrong, but one of his children discovered this hole, or this area, this kind of a hole in the side of the hill. And I wouldn't necessarily say, I don't know whether he fell in it.
That's what he said, that they were on the hill shooting B-reels for the church, and he was there with his family, and they noticed that one of their children was just gone. They couldn't find him. And they kind of scoured the hill, and they found this kind of cave-in. So you could see that there was, plant life, and then all of a sudden just this hole. And they kind of called in the hole, and the child was there. And they had to go get some, from what I understand, jumper cables, and connect a bunch of jumper cables and actually lower them down to pull this child out.
Oh, that's right.
And then when they had pulled the child out, they took some pictures because they were like, this is just a weird sort of thing. I don't think he was expecting to, discover anything, but they sort of had.
Yeah.
So.
And the hole, when you see the hole, the structure of it is interesting. And we're actually going to feature this on next week's episode as well, because it's kind of critical to that story. But if you look at the picture, and those of you who only can hear us and can't see us, the picture actually has, you see the walls are actually made with like slate or some kind of rock placed on the sides. And so you can tell that a man had built some kind of, or men, I should say, dug into this hole and braced it back so that things could be in there. And you can be able to walk in, you can be able to go in and out of this hole or this room. And so you can see that it's definitely has a level of man-made structure to it that seems ancient. And
when I looked at the pictures, I like to go in old basements and things. So like I've been in probably some of the oldest buildings in Palmyra and in Western New York. So just kind of running around and looking at things, and it's different. It's not like the what they call like the lake stone foundation with the round stones and the mortar and cement. It's just this stone that's kind of squarish, stacked on top of each other, but nothing in between. You can kind of see roots kind of coming out. It's something that's you can tell is a little bit older. Yeah. And you can kind of see that there's a wall and it kind of arches, and what caved in was part of that arch or that ceiling.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting, there's been people that have told me that it was a cistern or some things like that, but like if you've lived in Western New York, I don't know if it could be a cistern for the visitor center or what, but it doesn't denote that.
Yeah.
Something else, I don't know what it is, but it's interesting that it was close to the top of the hill. He knows exactly where it is. There's a few people that know exactly where it is, but
do you know where exactly where it is, Mark?
I have not
You haven't figured it out
ventured
yet.
into. I haven't ventured into that. There have been times that I have gone to the top of the hill and I've been poking around, and typically, typically a missionary will come in and be like, "Hey, what are you doing?" And I'll be like, "Well, like,
What are you
you
doing here,
know,
young man?
and
So,
they don't necessarily like metal detectors or anything that can like
oh,
tell
shucks.
you that something's there. They're not a big fan of that. So I try to stay in the good graces of
Yeah, like a good boy, like a good member. So there you go. There's numerous things to think about when it comes to the Hill Cumorah and the comparison of the two arguments, and I'm sure it'll continue. But as I said, from the beginning, there is unless somebody in the comments, and that's what I'm going to go to now, and as we close right now, is please make comments. Be nice, obviously. Don't be a jerk or whatever. just be nice and clear as a bell. Uh, if you know things about the two Hill Cumorah theory, by all means, blitz it on the comments. But as I said, unless there's some kind of discussion from the church history or a comment from Joseph Smith or something anywhere that says that there is a second hill, show me. Otherwise, I'm sorry. That's the Hill Cumorah. That's it. The end of discussion. And we take it from there when we continue to do the rest, which is kind of what we're going to do in our next episode. We're going to kind of go into that here. So kind of stay tuned. We're going to continue the discussion of Hill Cumorah for the next episode, but focused on some other cool things that we wanted to bring up. And once again, thank you for listening to Hidden in the Heartland podcast. I'm Kels Goodman. This is Mark Burris, and we'll just be with you next week.